Hi, I'm Brad Dacus, president and founder of the Pacific Justice Institute. Welcome to Faith and Law. Let's take a look at this latest trending viral video.
The state of Michigan passed a bill that would make using the wrong pronouns a felony and finable up to
A
$10,000.
felony.
The legislation criminalizes causing someone to feel threatened by words. So what if I say I voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and someone in Michigan feels threatened by that? I go to jail? Not entirely,
We'll
but
represent
that's
you.
essentially what these lawmakers are paving the way for. The bill claims that repeated or continuing harassment of another individual that would reasonably make someone feel terrorized, frightened, or threatened could allow them to press charges.
Folks, this is tyranny. This is a clear assault on freedom of speech. This vague language of intimidation and threatening, this is vague to create fear and hesitation for people to be able to express themselves. And if it's deemed to be, for some reason, intimidating or harassing or threatening, they may be put behind bars. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of George Orwell's 1984, where fear gripped everything. Speech was controlled all the way down to the pronoun. Well, that's what we're talking about here. Control of speech all the way down to the pronoun, and legislatively compelling people to lie in order to keep from being potentially prosecuted, fined, and put behind bars. That, folks, is where we're at, and we have to deal with it. Well, this kind of tyranny affects not just the person on the street in the classroom, it's also going to affect and impact people at work. Well, we at Pacific Justice Institute are already addressing lots of cases where people are being fired because of their convictions in the workplace. And help talk about one of these cases, I'd like to bring on the show now PJI attorney Michael Peffer. Welcome to the show, Michael. I'm glad to have you on the program. So I understand you're dealing with a case that's involving a manager in a company. The case is entitled Ezra versus UMass Global. This is a company in California. And apparently one of their managers was fired simply because of their sincere religious beliefs and unwillingness for the company to accommodate those beliefs. Michael, tell us more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. It's always great to be here. And here we have a gentleman that was a supervisor in the tech department, the IT department, with UMass Global, which is a conglomeration of schools. For instance, they run Chapman School here in Southern California, but this person was again doing their work, and this out came the vaccine. And one of the things that I've really appreciated about the stand that PGI has taken on this vaccine is that it really is a tool for us not only to represent our client vigorously and stand up for their rights, but it's a stand that we need to take to help Christian employees not become second-class citizens at the in their jobs, just simply because they have sincerely held religious beliefs.
Okay, Michael, we're dealing with a manager in a company. So what are the implications that we could be facing if we see a lot of managers like this gentleman who has sincere religious convictions being removed from the workplace? I mean, could this affect upper level management if we see this trend continuing?
Absolutely. You know, it's kind of the thing that if a manager who has presumably proven his or herself to their employer, if they're not safe, if they can't raise religious objections to their faith, religious objections informed by their faith, then they are, what employee can withstand this? So it ends up that the people providing leadership across the country in different roles and various employers, none of them are going to be believers. And the tragedy of this is that oftentimes, in fact, I think most times, a good, solid manager who happens to be a believer is going to be one of the best managers, one of the best people to have in place to deal with the concerns of their employees. And here that was the case with this gentleman.
Now, I want to make something really clear here, because this is real important. Was Ezra, the manager, fired in any way because of his lack of competency or lack of performance on the job? Or was it simply and solely his religious beliefs and convictions not to be jabbed with a very controversial vaccine?
Yeah, and that's such a great point, Brad. We do know that Ezra was a great employee. There was no discipline on him. He had not been disciplined. There was no issue with regard to what he was doing for the company. The issue was pure and simple, his request for a religious accommodation to the vaccine. And we know, we've talked about this a lot, Brad, that there are a lot of people who believed that pursuant to their sincerely held religious beliefs, they couldn't get the vaccine. There was a conflict there. And that's something that employers are duty bound to try to accommodate. And many employers, including the one we're talking about, basically said, no, we're not going to even consider your religious exemption because we want 100% vaccination rate in our company, even though the law requires them to make reasonable efforts at accommodating people, employees who have these religious beliefs.
Okay, Michael, I know you've got a lot of cases like this. How do you think this one's going to turn out? What does it look like moving forward?
Yeah, Brad, these cases that we have filed this year, there's a lot, there's several of them, and what we're going to do though is we're going to take a deep dive into these employers' world and find out what their policies were. Did they even know the law? Did they even seek counsel to get to know the law in this area? And we know that even now, our Supreme Court has held that the law is that unless there's an undue burden, not some tiny burden, unless there's an undue burden, they have to make reasonable efforts in order to accommodate the religious beliefs. So we're going to find out how they did this, the processes they took, and we're going to take care of that as we do our discovery in this case. We're going to take depositions of the decision makers and basically make a case for our client.
Okay, Michael, thank you for what you're doing. I know a lot of people right now are relying on you and PJI for representation in this area. Keep up the good work. Well, folks, we're not just talking about the private sector here when it comes to tyranny. We're also talking about police officers, people in public service, losing their jobs, not because of competency, but because of their faith. To talk about this case, I want to bring on now the Washington State Attorney for Pacific Justice Institute, Tracy Tribbett. Tracy, welcome to the program. And tell me, what's going on with this case? What's this case about involving this police officer?
Thank you for having me, Brad. Yes, our client, Cheyenne Dixon, worked for over 4 months as a police officer, which is a civil servant in the state of Washington, and her employer, the city of Issaquah, stated that it was an undue hardship to accommodate her in her position, and yet they went on to accommodate her November, December, and January, and terminated her right before she qualified for a bonus, which they had paid to employees who worked throughout the pandemic, including our client, who was then denied that bonus pay.
Okay. Help me figure this out, Tracy. So why was this police officer fired when multiple times he was accommodated because of his religious beliefs and convictions? How'd this happen?
That's a great question, Brad. How did this happen? How could a person, this police officer, Cheyenne Dixon, be accommodated for a number of months after the pandemic policy of our governor, who issued Proclamation 21-14, required of many municipalities and first responders that they obtain the COVID-19 vaccine? That does not, in and of itself, relieve the employer of finding a reasonable accommodation for these civil servants. And what happened was that the city was short staffed. They didn't want to fire my client. They knew that they couldn't reasonably accommodate her long term, even though they could short term to suit their needs. And then they terminated her as soon as they were able, which is truly unfair to those who risk their lives day in and day out as civil servants in our public communities. And as these small cities are finding, there is an extreme shortage of applicants for police officers. This particular department was down something like 10 police officers, and they, in the midst of that shortage, fired our client, who was more than willing and able to work because she would not be vaccinated.
Okay, Tracy, so I'm a little concerned about this because here we're talking about a police officer, and to what extent do you see an impact if we have police officers like this who have sincere religious convictions, police officers of faith, being booted out of their jobs? What kind of impact could that have on our society? I see this as very serious.
You're absolutely right, Brad. This is very concerning on multiple levels. If our government can begin to discriminate against Christians because they won't follow vaccination or other medical procedure policy from government entities in carrying out their duties, they will be terminated. And really, the crux of these cases is whether or not it was reasonable to accommodate an employee with masking and testing during the pandemic. And that is what our client asked for. That would have been easily accommodated. And the employer is still saying, nope, this is an undue burden for us to do what we did throughout the pandemic. They didn't pay for the tests. Masks were always in plenty supply. They have no proof and no evidence that masks ever failed in any of these civil servant first responder cases. There literally is a lack of evidence that any civil servant or first responder had a mask failure at any time during the pandemic. And I think on that basis alone, this case should be, what I would call a no-brainer in the courts. We can hope for that. We don't always know what the courts will determine, although with the recent rulings in the Groff case, that helps all of our clients and all of our cases as it relates to the vaccination. However, I hear what you're saying, Brad. This is very concerning, even on a community level. What kinds of individuals do you want patrolling your streets? Do you want a cross-section of what the faith-based community is in your particular community to be able to apply for these police officer jobs? Because under the current vaccine mandates, and as we see in our client's case, all God-fearing Christians were terminated from civil servant service. A true travesty, Brad.
Well, personally, Tracy, I like officers that have faith. So the worst thing they could do is eliminate police officers that have faith, that believe there's something more than just the law that they're held accountable to. So this is a very important case. I know other people in law enforcement and other areas of public service are watching this case very closely. Well, how do you think it's going to turn out? How does this case look going forward?
We've got a strong case, Brad. What we have here is a sincerely held religious belief. And as you know, under these types of cases where an individual requests a religious accommodation, they have to notify their employer that they have a conflict with a policy due to their sincerely held religious beliefs. Our client notified her employer. Her employer determined that they could not accommodate her without an undue burden or hardship. However, they did so accommodate her for 3 months. And I think a lot of employers, especially for our civil servants, Brad, are under the impression that because they had to bargain with the union, that they are not held to account for the reasonable accommodation process. And I'm here to say that employers are responsible for accommodating their employees with sincerely held religious beliefs. That is not something that they can offshore onto the unions to negotiate and bargain for them. Regardless of what happens at the union level, there is a statutory duty for the employer to reasonably accommodate the client. And so I feel very strong about this case going forward, Brad, on that premise.
Well, Tracy, I know you have a number of cases like this that you're handling there in Washington State, along with our other attorneys in Washington State. It's keeping us very busy. Keep up the great work, and I look forward to our next update.
Well, they're in the trenches and they're fighting, and PGI is on the front lines for the battle for freedom and liberty. They've been doing so much to equip pastors across the country and to really fight for the values that have made this country so great. Honored to be supportive of PGI.
We're living in a time when Christians are constantly under assault for their beliefs in the marketplace. And if there's not someone to advocate for them and help them with the legal necessities of defending themselves, they're going to get fired. They have no recourse. Most people don't have the resources to go hire a lawyer. It would deplete everything they own. And most lawyers, quite frankly, across the country don't deal in religious liberty issues.
Well, we're living in some very difficult days in America where basic freedoms and especially religious liberty is under attack. And that's one of the reasons why Pacific Justice Institute is so vitally important to the future of this nation. What a great group of lawyers, first-class, top-rate lawyers who are willing to stand up for freedom and stand up for our American citizens under attack.
Yeah, I mean, they can support, they can follow, they can pray. We need more organizations like PJI, and I can tell you that being in the front lines, there's not enough people that are actually in the trenches doing the difficult but tough work, and that's exactly why this organization is so critical.
One of the most incredible things about Pacific Justice Institute is that they do pro bono work. And what does that mean? Well, it means the rest of us have a responsibility. We've got to stand up and provide financial incentives and financial opportunities for these attorneys to get out there and do the fighting. And that's one of the reasons why we have Pacific Justice Institute attorneys on my national radio show, because we want to let people know, hey, there's a need here. These folks are doing very important work, and they're doing very important, successful work as well. And that's why they need our support.
When a Christian is targeted for his or her beliefs, it affects every believer in America. This idea that, well, it didn't happen to me, well, you're next. And when Pacific Justice Institute takes on a case, it's not just that one individual that they really are representing, because a legal precedent may be established from that will protect 1 million believers who could be in the same position for the exact same issue.
So folks, we've taken a look at a recent viral video and the attitudes that are taking place out there in the public. We've taken a look at the law and the challenges legally when it comes to these issues of tyranny. But in the end, I always want to go back to Scripture. What does God's Word say about these issues and our philosophy and attitude in dealing with them? So let's take a look at Romans 8:7. It says, "The carnal mind is hostile against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor can it do so." Basically what this verse is saying is, reality is humans on our own cannot do what is right. We're going to go through a downward spiral when we take God out of our lives. And we have this innate capacity for tyranny if left to ourselves. That's why it's so important that we fight tyranny when we see it, because it will infect society. It requires a proactive effort to combat it, to maintain justice, to maintain what's right in our society. And that is what we at PJI are trying to do. Another verse I want to take a look at is Galatians 3:21. It says, "Is the law," that is God's law, "is the law against the promises of God? Certainly not. For if there has been a law given which could have given life, truly righteousness would have been by the law." So basically what this is saying is promoting right over wrong, it's not good enough. Just having an understanding of what we need to do as far as the right things, that's not going to change society. What changes society, folks, goes beyond that. And that is a change of the heart. And that is for individuals to come to a personal and real understanding of God and his love and his forgiveness and transformation through faith in Jesus Christ. That's the Christian worldview. And that Christian worldview needs to be spread. It needs to be shared in our society today, now more than ever. So, folks, we've got a lot of challenges facing us. But remember this, always, always keep the faith.